So I thought we could talk tonight just about this evolution during our own lifetime. Sort of a broad brush look at how we got to where we are, right? So we can think about growing up. Growing up is one thing. Awakening isn't the same thing. Awakening isn't um, a mature state of adulthood where we, finally perfect our adult nature. It's not that. It's not unrelated either, but it's not the same thing. So let's just look at sort of um, three very broad categories of our development, and then there's a fourth possibility. So the first one is just infancy, right? Up to maybe 2 years old. Um, Most of us don't have uh, any recollection of that period because my guess is that it's because it was pre-verbal. We didn't have a context for anything. Everything was just new. We were present for it. It was amazing, exciting, um, confusing. Um, we certainly had um, things that made us feel good, you know, a full belly, a warm embrace, comfortable bed, dry diaper, all of that feels good. So we had, physical needs, but we didn't verbalize those. We didn't, um, you know, tell ourselves stories about what may or may not happen in the future, what happened yesterday in the past. It was just all being totally present there for each moment. We couldn't go to future and past because we didn't have the conceptual mental abilities to do that. It was just the present moment in awareness, fully present, but unaware of our own body mind as a separate entity from anything that we were seeing in that field of awareness. It took us, I don't know, a year and a half, maybe year and a half, 2 years, to even discover that this body had some relationship to what I was feeling internally. You've maybe seen a child discover their toes for the first time. I mean, there's, laughter and delight and giggling and surprise, and that they can see something apparently um, out in their field of vision, and yet sense it internally at the same time. So there is this state of grace initially, this state of spacious awareness that we talk about now, but it was happening for all of us at an early age in our life. That period came to an end relatively early in our life. So we may not have any conscious memory of that at all because we didn't have the verbal skills to put it into a concept that we could retell ourselves. It was all just pure experience, pure sensation. Um, and you know, the next phase is childhood, which we can take to be from early childhood up through teenagehood, just a broad category of transition from infancy to adulthood. So what usually kicked off this transition into childhood from infancy is actually depicted in the biblical story of Adam and Eve at the Garden of Eden. And if you remember the mythology of it, what caused them to be ejected from the Garden of Eden was that they ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now that doesn't seem that bad, does it? I mean, eating the fruit of a tree of knowledge, you would think that'd be a good thing, you know? We become more knowledgeable. And that is what happens, right? And probably the first bite that we took out of the apple was learning our name or learning, you know, mommy and daddy, their names, and then we go from there. You know, so we get quickly introduced to more and more concepts about, you know, how we should behave, you know, what's socially appropriate, how we should act around other people, how we should be responsible. And very early on, we learn that what we are is separate. And we can see this in, you know, 2 or 3 year olds where they discover the power of declaring things to be in their possession, right? They've discovered the separate self identity, and they realize that there's a benefit to pulling things into that gravitational field, right? This toy is mine, you know, I demand this now. I want attention now, you know, so that sudden discovery that they are separate, they have needs, and they discover ways to get them, right? If cuteness doesn't work, there's always, you know, just a terror attack. You know, just completely losing it in Walmart. And it usually works, right? It's enough to reinforce that sense of, yes, I'm a separate self, and I can manipulate other people, like my parents. So just moving quickly ahead, we find ourselves in teenagehood. But along the way, there are times especially in our early childhood, when, well, especially when big people aren't around, where we can fall back into almost that playful innocence, you know, where we can just be free of all the shoulds and shouldn'ts and rules that are quite complex, that adults are trying to impose on us, and we can just revert to just play, right? Or a daytime reverie. We can do that with our young friends, and it's a delight. And then, but we can't do it so well if adults are around. Then we have to sort of toughen up and, you know, try to act our age. But then as we move into, you know, later childhood, into teenagehood, then there's this whole movement to create, adopt an identity. You know, it's almost, there's a bit of desperation there. And, you know, people, it's almost like, what's that game where you go around in a circle and there's one less chair every time? You know what that is? Anyway, you know, so in teenagehood, they sort of, some of the select identities are gobbled up pretty quickly. You know, the most popular, you know, the most athletic, the smartest one, the most rebellious one, the funniest one. You know, so those sort of prime identities are taken up quickly. And then so most of us are left sort of scrambling to, you know, find some identity that sort of works for us, that we can sort of get away with, that we can, you know, put on that mask and have it feel okay and have other people buy into it, right? Whatever that identity is, but the important thing is to have one. And along with this is another aspect of having been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. You know, the pictures associated with that myth is often around nudity, but the real issue is self-consciousness, right? Where we suddenly realize that we have this apparently individual self that we become quite concerned about. You know, we become conscious of this sense of self. So it's almost like there is this um, frequent, almost constant need to step out of ourselves and look back at ourselves, and basically with the idea of how am I doing now? You know, am I being liked? Am I making friends? Am I making a good impression? You know, did I comb my hair right this morning? You know, all of this sort of self-concern, um, and you know that's the other thing that didn't wasn't happening in our infancy. We didn't even have any awareness of a separate self at all, and suddenly we're having to defend it, improve it, um, you know, fix it, you know, worry about our appearance of it. All of this. So all of this concern that's refocused on our own self. Um, and in the meantime, we're trying to adopt an identity, sort of get ready for adulthood. And I don't know about you, but I found some people talk about how wonderful high school was. That wasn't my experience. My experience was high school was hard. You know, high school was really hard. And but there's this, at some point, you find yourself sort of um, being nudged into adulthood. And some of that might depend on how willing our parents are to foot the bill for a while. But in any event, usually by in our 20s, sometimes we find ourselves out there, at least impersonating an adult. So that begins our third phase, adulthood. Right? A lot of people, you know, barely make it out of, you know, the teenage phase. I mean, they look like adults and dress like adults, but, you know, they're not that far out of, you know, still trying to work on their image and defend their thing, and yet being very self-conscious about it all the while. So as we move into adulthood, then we find ourselves at first being quite enthusiastic about that, right? Often, not always, but um, enthusiastic with finally getting to the role where we can um, be big people, you know, where we can make our own choices, you know, take this body mind out into the world for a test drive, see what it'll do, see how far it can go, how much it can learn, what it can um, become skilled at, you know, forming relationships, maybe forming families, having children, um, you know, and as we're doing this, there are certain characteristics that we have, a sense of ourself, you know, our self-judgments, our ideas about the world, our opinions, our, you know, philosophies um, begin to, you know, gradually get more and more solidified. You know, when we were younger, they were quite malleable, but as we, you know, sort of step into more responsible roles, they tend to rigidify, maybe in a good way, you know, maybe in a highly functional way, um, you know, maybe in a highly, um, you know, creative way, or, you know, family-oriented way, different levels of responsibility. And that can feel really good. So it seems like a natural movement from, um, you know, of this forming an identity and then just sort of carving our place out in the world. And that, in our culture, that's highly respected, right? You know, rugged individualism, you know, making our own way. Um, you know, that's highly respected. Um, and so, you know, when we're moving out in the world like that, we have the support of our culture, to sort of keep going, be responsible, and with the promise, spoken or implied, that there's happiness down that road. Just keep at it, more of it, push harder, and there will be rewards, trust me. So there's a lot of that, sort of cultural pressure to move in that direction. Not all of us take up on that, encouragement. We might rebel against it, seek our pleasures in different ways. But with this with this outward movement, the other thing that's happening is that there is a crystallization of this sense of individual personal self, right? So at this time, I mean, we have history, we have a storyline, we have, maybe a career, skills, social situation. We have a car, maybe a house or someplace that we live. All of those things can somehow define us, along with our hopes and dreams and feelings and fears and regrets, and all of that seems to reside in this body-mind. And all of it points to, culturally, it presumes that because of all of those sensations, memories, perceptions are appearing within this body-mind, there must be a separate self in there somewhere. That's what gets crystallized. We never really even question it. We never did. It just sort of grew up when we grew up, and and now, if anyone talks about or questions this sense of separate self, it's an odd thing when we first encounter it. Like, really? I mean, how can that not be true, right? So this sense of achievement and success and putting our life together and establishing a certain familiar pattern within which we function every day, for a while feels very empowering, right? We're moving out into the world, finally getting our feet on the ground, having a steady income, having a family, perhaps. That movement can feel good. And yet, there may come a time, maybe a decade later, maybe a few, where a lot of those accumulated aspects of our life is still intact, but they haven't paid off like we assumed they would. Right? They're familiar, but it feels like we've sort of explored the extent of what is available in this lifetime, and to explore further. We're just dealing in the same scope, right? We may pursue different things, but they're still within that same outgoing movement where we're trying to derive meaning and purpose from our life. Right? And convince ourselves that that is what's happening. But over time, it may begin as sort of a dull ache, almost like the first sensation, way before the term toothache is appropriate. But the first sensation, oh, there's something a little different there. Nothing to do. Maybe it's nothing. But over time, this sense of something's not quite enough. I mean, it almost could be phrased as, I wonder if this is all that life is about. You know, could that really be true? And most of the time we say, no, that couldn't be true. Um, you know, let's go out to dinner. Let's do something enjoyable. That'll perk me back up again. You know, if that doesn't work, maybe a new car or a new relationship or who knows what, beach house, vacation. That'll do it. You know, so over time, we as we continue to move out looking for ways to satisfy this sense of separate self, um, it's almost like we have to keep feeding it somehow, keep feeding it either pleasurable events or the possibility of pleasurable events. You know, it's not happening now, but next week it will be, or next month, or next year, or when I retire, or when the kids leave home, or when, you know, I get that new job, or when, you know, so this is, you know, efforts to sort of keep things alive and hopeful, like the pot of gold will be found. We just haven't gotten there yet. But as time goes on, it becomes more and more difficult to convince us that simply more of the same will result in fulfillment. Right? And we may, at this point, we may be, you know, highly functional adults, grown up in every sense of the word, right? Good at what we do, responsible, community-minded, socially responsible, ethical, etc. We've got the bases covered. And yet there can still be this feeling like, yes, and it's not quite enough. I don't know, has anybody felt like that? So we can be highly functional adults, but that doesn't necessarily lead to awakening. Awakening isn't a further improvement or adding on a philosophy to that or a belief system to that. That's not what waking up is. So we can be, you know, highly functional adults. There's some things from that efforting throughout a, you know, a large part of our life that has perhaps a benefit to awakening, like just the ability to focus, you know, the ability to dedicate oneself. But often, you know, people who have pursued that level of, let's say, you know, what in corporate terms is called excellence, have gotten too comfortable, right? Too comfortable to question it. So it's almost like they settle in for the duration. You know, life might not be quite as exciting as I had once hoped it would be, but it's good. You know, I'll go with that. You know, it's you know, I've had a good life. You know, I'll just ride it out from here. Right. So having that level of accomplishment doesn't necessarily lead to awakening, might even be a barrier to awakening, where someone else might have had a really difficult childhood, a challenging life. There might be a lot of motivation to wake up from that, right? So it's not about you know, one's lifestyle. It's not about one's age. There's no particular pattern of what may cause one person rather than another to step into a really true spiritual investigation. You know, so what I mean by true spiritual investigation might be compared to something that is just um, you know, socially desirable, interesting, um, gives one a, spiritual identity. That can all be done within adulthood, right? Um, but if we uh, find that that adulthood is, even though it might be okay and feel pretty good, um, we might find ourselves feeling restless, um, like we're just not willing to settle in for the rest of our life. We really have to find out what's going on here. We have an opportunity while we're alive to understand what this life is about. And we might find ourselves, sort of diving headlong into a process that we may not understand. Or we may be thrown into that by some calamitous event. There's a saying that man's catastrophe is God's opportunity. Sometimes that's what it takes. But we get there from a point of being disillusioned with the promises made in terms of how life will pay off, in terms of contentment or feeling at home in this world, or whether it's by some serious event to our health or wealth or relationship or something. Whatever pushes us into that true spiritual search doesn't take us out of the realm of adulthood, but throws us into something that has a momentum of its own once we step into that field. So that's really the fourth possibility. Not everyone makes it into fully functional adult. Very few actually take the leap even into deep investigation of what they truly are. Even very few of the people who consider themselves spiritual seekers are actually in this phase after human adulthood, where they're really seeking not just to feel better, but to know what's actually true. They're quite different things. So this fourth possibility, it's really the possibility of full evolution within this lifetime. It's not a matter of how many lifetimes or how much karmic debt we have to pay off, etc. It's really how sincere are we to really look at what's living this life, this current life. That's the possibility. And so what is available to be seen is seen that what is present is already fully available. What's preventing us from seeing it is all the accumulated beliefs and ideologies and history and thoughts that we've accumulated in a lifetime since infancy, to see through that entire package. We don't have to do it one thing at a time, like psychiatric work, where we're solving this problem and then two more crop up. It's seeing just the nature of that belief in a separate egoic self. And we can do that relatively easy, actually. It's not necessarily easy, but it's simple. It's as simple as that little exercise we did at the beginning when we just sensed into that awareness that is already present. That's the practice. If we can stay with that one simple practice, it will be sufficient to really sense into what is that awareness. Is that awareness indeed what I am? Not just as a philosophical feel-good experience, but actually what I am, what is actually living this life. That's the possibility. When that's seen, what follows from that, maybe not immediately, but with time, as the implications of that realization are fully penetrate this body-mind, is that there is a contentment there that's not dependent on whether we're having a good day or a bad day. It's just content. There is a rekindlement of joy and awe and curiosity about life and gratitude to be living this life. Sense of aliveness, a sense of presence, sense of being at ease with oneself and in the world. There's that, what we touch back into is that spaciousness that we had as infants, but this time with a knowingness from having explored our mind, these bodies, the world. So it's not the innocence of an infant, but it is the spaciousness of that openness, that degree of receptivity, openness, but with the knowingness of how the world works, how this body, mind functions. Not all the biology, but just the how our entire experience happens within this field of awareness. That realization sets us free from all that sense of identity and self-consciousness. And we can see that is tied entirely to a belief that we have about this body-mind as being separate from the rest of existence. It's almost like if we imagine life, to be one of those pie charts, this tiniest of slivers over here is me, and then everything else is not me, right? That's how most of us view life. But when we can see that what we call me is only perceptions and experiences and thoughts and feelings appearing within awareness. All experiences of other people are the same. So we begin to lose that distinction of what this particular body mind is feeling as a thought or a feeling, and see that it's in essence as an appearance within awareness. It's not really all that different from witnessing another person or a flower or a cloud or a hurricane or whatever. They're all appearances. So this movement away from the sense of personal self, it sounds scary, right? It sounds like, well, how do I even do that? Why would I want to give up something that I'm quite convinced of, for one thing, and it's so familiar? I've spent a lifetime sort of polishing, this particular egoic sense. Why would I give that up? Good question, right? Why? Right? You'd only give it up if you had to. You wouldn't just give it up just because we don't know what we're giving it up for. That's the challenge of it. It's almost as if we feel like we're being asked to give up something and we don't know what we're going to get. There's, we've heard stories, sure, about, eternal bliss, and that would be nice. But how much can we really trust those stories? It feels like we're giving up something real for something maybe. But so the only, at the end of the day, the only reason that we move further in that direction is when we don't have any choice. It's almost like life paints us into a corner where it's too late to go back and forget what we've seen, and yet going forward feels threatening. And at this point, I mean, I've heard people say, well, how do I know I'll even feel like going to work? How do I know I'll even feel like taking care of my family? How do I know I might just not sit on the couch and stare out the window for the rest of my life? And the thing is that you don't know how that will look. But I can say that what is authentic in your life will not be lost. What is inauthentic in your life may be at risk, right? When we decide to step into, what's truly meaningful. I mean, I remember a point in my own life where it was real clear in a moment that I had a choice to, sort of live out the duration in a state of quiet desperation, or make a change, right? Or look at things, take a chance and not knowing what would happen, right? Not knowing where that would lead to. Security here, no security there, right? And we can make whatever choice we make. But there is that possibility. But the question is really like if someone says, well, how do I know I feel like taking care of my kids if if I wake up, right? But the implication of that is somehow I'll be of greater service to my kids if I remain asleep, right? If I remain oblivious to my true nature, somehow that is of greater service to my kids or to my partner. It's clearly not true. So this movement where this sense of personal self, which is just built on, it's just a constellation of thoughts that over a lifetime has convinced us is actually true, that there actually is a separate being in there somewhere. We can't quite pin it down, but in there somewhere, I'm sure. I mean, it's not in my hand, it's not in my foot, but somewhere in there, I'm sure it is. So that certainty about a separate self is what's at stake, and its demise can feel like a death. Right? Not an actual death, but it's like a psychological death. That's what it feels like. But what's it the death of? It's the death of a misunderstanding. It's the seeing through maybe a familiar, comfortable, illusory belief in one's own separation apart from the rest of the world. So there's a quote in the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, but it has some very interesting, it's all just quotes, Jesus quotes. One of the quotes is that heaven is spread upon the earth and people do not see it. It's not, he's saying it's not far away, it's not an afterlife, it's here now and we're missing it. And why are we missing it? If it's spread upon the earth, there's nowhere where it's not, right? How can we not see that? And I'd suggest that it's because of this certainty of the existence of a separate egoic self that's hard to get rid of. You might do battle with it, but it's persistent. Right? In the meantime, awareness is watching the whole drama. It's not like the separate self wins that battle, where we, whoever that is victorious over this imaginary separate self. You can't do battle with an imaginary entity, right? What the resolution is to see that it's imaginary. Always has been. Then there's no battle, that's just over and done with. But it, like I say, it can feel like a death. In Sufis, there's an expression, die before you die, so that you may truly live. Right? If we're talking about physicality, it doesn't make any sense at all. Die before you die. Well, what does that even mean if we're talking about physicality? So they're talking about something else. Die before you die so that you may truly live. So what is being asked to be terminated is this false sense of me as an independent, separate being apart from everything else. The interesting thing is very similar sayings appear in quite a wide variety of spiritual traditions. Again, back to Jesus says, whoever seeks to keep his life will lose it, and whoever loses it will preserve it. So this the same thing. If we try to hang on to the sense of who we are, we'll expend our life and without ever having seen what it was really about. But if we're willing to just step outside the capsule long enough to see what is really living this life, we can see that it never was the case. It's not that we have to fix it, improve it, earn merit, love it, have the right experience for it. It's just seeing that it never was who we were, never. We thought it was, we acted like it was. We were, sort of assumed that it was. The whole culture supported that belief, but it was never who we were. Okay, a couple of more quotes here. This is from Zen Master Bankei. All things are perfectly resolved in the unborn. So we're not talking about genetics here, right? We're not talking about, our grandparents or everything is perfectly resolved in the unborn. So what's unborn? Clearly this body, mind is born, has a lifespan, and it will die. That much is certain, right? So what's unborn, uncreated, undying? The only possible candidate is awareness, right? Because it's formless, as we said earlier. It is without form. All things having form, whether a bird, a tree, a thought, a feeling, all have beginning, a certain lifespan, and an ending, right? The only thing within our experience is not a thing, but the only thing within our experience is awareness, right? Formless, changeless, unborn, undying, right? All things are perfectly resolved in the unborn. Okay, one last quote here. This is Lao Tzu, I don't know, 6th century BC Taoist Chinese. Very specific, very clear. To die but not to perish is to be eternally present. Can't get much more clear than that. To die but not to perish is to be eternally present. So what, again, this death, it sounds fearsome, right? Ego death. But all it is the dropping away of an illusion once seen. Once it's seen, the nature of an illusion is to drop away. Once it's seen, we don't have to try to make it go away. If we see a piece of rope in the grass and, at first we're frightened because we think it's a snake, and then we jump back and then we say, no, it's just a piece of rope. We don't have to try to get rid of the snake anymore. It's just seen, well, it's not, it's just no longer an issue. It just never was, right? And it's the same with seeing this mistaken belief, this mistaken identity. That's it. It can feel scary or wondrous. It can feel anything. It can feel freeing. It can feel threatening. All of those things are possible. But what's actually feeling those things is not the experience of recognition of our own awareness. It's actually our mind stepping back in and making a judgment about what was seen, making a judgment about the nature of awareness. Awareness itself is fine. It's not in any way frightening or terrorizing. We've actually, all of us, our entire life, have lived life from that awareness. We just took personal credit for it. So it's not actually new. It's just recognition of what is already the case. But we're so convinced of our individual, separate, egoic self that it feels like a big deal. Feels like we're giving up the entirety of what we are. And we're not. We're giving up a mistaken identity. That's what we give up.